Moving on to the 12-mark question. With reference to Extract C, discuss the potential conflicts between the macro objectives when the central bank attempts to control inflation. So the Bank of England tries to control inflation. What are the conflicts? It's a classic macro objectives conflicts question. So it's a really good question here, and let's get right into it. So let's have a read through the initial parts of section C to see if we can find anything here. So the Bank of England have told lenders, so the banks, they need to build a special reserve worth 11.4 billion by the end of 2018 as it tries to make banks more resilient to the risk posed by mounting consumer debt. The reserve of assets that can be readily turned into cash is a way of forcing banks to set aside capital reserves in good times in order to keep lending to the wider economy at a steady level even during economic downturn. In 2017, the Bank of England told UK banks it would raise the reserve ratio relative to all assets from 0 to 0.5% and forecast a further increase to 1% by the end of 2017. So what's happening here in summary? So the Bank of England is essentially telling the UK banks, you're lending out too much and consumers are borrowing too much. And to stop another financial crisis happening, we need these banks to be safer. And how can we make these banks more safe? We need them to increase their reserve ratio. Basically, they need some money aside. So if things go bad, if there's an economic downturn, like it says, they have some spare cash ready to be used. They have some money on the side that they can use on a rainy day. This actually would be an example of contractionary monetary policy. It's not the classic contractionary monetary policy, but we call it macroprudential policy. So it's not technically in the spec, but it's a good thing to, I don't know whether you can read that, but it's macroprudential. I can't really say it very well. The reason why we'd call this contractionary monetary policy is essentially, is very simple thinking, is that if banks have to save more, it therefore means they're going to lend less. If banks are lending less, it means that, of course, consumers are able to take on less debt, they're able to borrow less, and if consumers are able to borrow less, of course, it doesn't stimulate AD as much, thus meaning it contracts the economy, meaning that is a contractionary policy. And then let's just keep on reading. For 2017, consumer borrowing grew by 10.3% on an annual basis, rising car loans, credit card debt. This may be no bad thing as far as the Bank of England is concerned, even if it does have a negative impact on the wider economy. So let's start actually planning this question. Like I said, it's just a classic macro objectives conflicts question. The first paragraph point I am going to mention is inflation versus unemployment, which will be featuring the nice diagram of the Phillips curve. We have y-axis, we have x-axis, so we have inflation, and that's a percentage, and then we have unemployment, which of course also a percentage. And now what does the Phillips curves look like? It's just like a nice little curve. It's just like almost an L-shaped curve, and this we'd label this the SRPC, which represents the short-run Phillips curve. Now, what is the main thing the Phillips curve shows us? And let's do a bit of labeling to show this. So let's see what this shows us. When inflation rate is high, so when we're at pi 1, what is happening to unemployment? Unemployment is low. So when inflation is high, unemployment is low. When inflation is low, unemployment is higher. And that is the general rule you need to keep in mind with the Phillips curve. It's quite easy to get this confused, but always remember, high inflation leads to low unemployment, and low inflation leads to high unemployment. Thus, this is why we can say these macro objectives trade off. Why? What is the macro objective with low inflation? Of course, it's 2% plus or minus 1%. So therefore, we need a low rate of inflation, but then also we want a low rate of unemployment. So therefore, we say by achieving one of them, it trades off with the other one. So it stops us achieving. So by achieving low inflation, it stops us achieving low unemployment. But in the exam, the main marks will not come from just stating the trade-off. It will come from explaining the trade-off. And I think a really appropriate way to explain this trade-off is specifically looking at when there's high inflation, there is low levels of unemployment. And why is that? So when we're achieving the macro objective of low unemployment, we will, however, suffer from high inflation. But now let's explain to the examiner why this happens. So like I said, there's low unemployment. But what does this actually mean? This therefore would mean there's a tight labour market. What does a tight labour market mean? All that means is that there's not many workers available. As the name suggests, if there's low unemployment, most people are employed, meaning that there's not a lot of workers available. There's not a lot of spare capacity within the economy. The tight labour market will therefore cause increased bargaining power for workers. So each worker now has increased bargaining power, which therefore means they can negotiate higher wages. As why? Because there's not many workers to go around. It means firms also have to pay workers higher wages to attract that labour, and that is due to the higher bargaining power. So tight labour market, this leads to higher bargaining power for workers. So now, if workers negotiate higher wages, how is that going to now affect the firm? Of course, wages are a cost for a firm, therefore a firm's costs now increase. And you can add even more detail into that. So you can say this therefore means a firm's wage costs increase in sectors that hire lots of human workers, such as like airlines. This will therefore mean, as wages are a large percentage of their total costs, it will lead to a spike in total costs for the firm. And just generally, when we say firms' costs are increasing, how can we show that on a diagram? Of course, we can show that on the SRASAD diagrams. Let me just get this labelled up. Of course, price level on your y-axis, real GDP on your x-axis. Like I said, how can you see a firm's costs are increasing? Of course, you shift SRAS inwards to SRAS1, and now let's see the effects on our axes. So real GDP, so price level is going to increase from PLE to PL1. And what do we call this? Of course, this is what we refer to as cost push inflation. Therefore, when firms' wage costs increase, it is a cost push inflation. And why does that tie in with our theory beforehand? As now, so it's come full circle now. So due to the low levels of unemployment, like we said, workers have higher bargaining power, they would negotiate higher wages, therefore firms' costs increase, therefore pushing price level from PLE to PL1, thus meaning that is why there is a trade-off between low unemployment and high inflation. As when there's low unemployment, like we said, firms' costs are increased, meaning that it leads to inflationary pressure. And with regards to context, of course, you can of course quote this in. It literally says at the bottom of the extract where the lowest rates of unemployment since 1975, so we will be suffering from higher inflation due to those reasons. So that is the theory behind that paragraph on the Phillips curve. But now I always try to give you my own way how I would answer it if I was in the exam. So the first paragraph for this 12-mark question. So like I say, make sure you've watched the perfect paragraph structure video. So always state your point. How do you state your point? You want to reuse as many words in the question as possible. So the way I'd word it is, I agree there are potential conflicts between the macroeconomic objectives when the central bank attempts to control inflation due to the trade-off with unemployment as explained by the Phillips curve. That is my point. Remember, in your point, you want no explanation, no chains of analysis, simple, straightforward point. Then I would move on to a bit of application. And then, of course, you have an extract here. I did tell you guys to use this bit of application, but I am probably going to use that later on. My bit of application here is probably just going to be a general bit about interest rates. So an example of expansionary monetary policy. So the way I'm going to pursue the chain of analysis is I'm going to say, for example, the UK pursued expansionary monetary policy as seen from December 2024 to December 2025, which is currently when I'm recording this video. So currently interest rates right now are 4%, but back last year, this time last year, the 3rd of December last year, the interest rates were 4.75%. So that shows interest rates have dropped 0.75%, and with interest rates dropping, of course, that would be an example of expansionary monetary policy. That's my point stated. Moving on to the application. So of course you have the extract here, and specifically we have extract C. Which part of extract C am I going to quote? I'm going to quote the macroprudential policy, so the contractionary monetary policy, which is essentially where banks have to increase their reserve percentage from 0 to 0.5%, then eventually to 1%. And that's going to be my application there. Okay, and then I'm going to move on to my point. The way I'm going to start my point is I'm not going to jump straight into the theory of the Phillips curve. I'm going to slowly introduce it and give a bit of context. And the context I'm going to give is contractionary monetary policy. So I'm going to say the government may decide, the UK government may decide to pursue contractionary monetary policy. Then because we've just given an example of contractionary monetary policy, but explain why the government would pursue some contractionary monetary policy. If you think about the business cycle, what stage of the business cycle do we have to be at for the government to pursue contractionary monetary policy? Of course, we're at a boom, inflation is too high, thus we're trying to contract the economy, we're trying to reduce that inflation rate, and a byproduct of trying to reduce that inflation rate is contracting of the economy or decreasing of real GDP. So that would be my first few lines in the chain of analysis. Then, now after a few lines, I picked up a few really easy marks. Now I'm going to go into explain the Phillips curve. So they're like 3, 4, maybe 5 lines in chains of analysis where if I jump straight into the Phillips curve, I'm not going to pick them up. That means I'm not showing the examiner that depth of knowledge I have. Therefore, so now, once I've explained that little initial bit, I'm therefore then going to show him the Phillips curve. I'm going to explain the Phillips curve to him. So before we pursue that contractionary monetary policy, we're at a high inflation rate, so pi 1. And then, of course, pi 1, I'm going to firstly just explain, give a bit of diagrammatic analysis. So when we're at a high inflation rate, of course, as you can see, unemployment levels are low, but then vice versa, when then the governments decide to pursue this contractionary monetary policy, when inflation rate eventually does go down, it leads to high levels of unemployment. Then explain why that happens in the rest of the chain of analysis. And yeah, that's pretty much how I do it. So I'm not going to re-explain this entire chain again because that's just economic theory. But yeah, then just conclude it saying, yes, there definitely is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation due to the short-run Phillips curve. Now, moving on to the evaluation stage of this paragraph, how am I going to evaluate this theory? How am I going to evaluate the Phillips curve? And this is a really good one where once you've tackled this question and you've learned a few of these evaluation points, you can pretty much reuse them whenever you write the Phillips curve out. So whichever macro conflict question you get on inflation versus unemployment, you can pretty much use the same evaluation points here. And that is one of the main commonalities I saw between all my A-star students. A lot of the evaluation was just reused and recycled. So classic thing I used to suggest for my A-star students is have a separate book for evaluation. And the way I do it is write out that scenario. So write out the scenario, then write out why that's a really good evaluation point. A classic one is, a classic question you're always going to be arguing, writing chains of analysis for, is expansionary monetary policy. So how expansionary monetary policy stimulates the economy, stimulates AD. But then a classic and a really good evaluation point for expansionary monetary policy and interest rates in specific is a liquidity trap. So one of the things in the notebook, so they write the scenario. So if I'm ever speaking about expansion monetary policy, the best evaluation point there is the liquidity trap, and then write out the evaluation point for the liquidity trap. This means now you can almost revise this booklet, and whenever you get a question on expansion monetary policy, you already have like almost a pre-rehearsed evaluation point ready to go, meaning you can pretty much prepare yourself for more scenarios if you write enough evaluation points out, meaning pretty much you should never be dropping marks on evaluation. And if you can secure your evaluation marks consistently, that is one of the main steps needed for the road to the A-star. But back onto this, what would be my first evaluation point with regards to the Phillips curve? So however, in evaluation, I would say this depends on the validity of the Phillips curve in the modern economy, in the modern day. And that is due to the concept of stagflation. So what is stagflation? It's essentially high inflation coupled with stagnation within the economy. So for example, we have low/negative economic growth, we have high rates of unemployment, and then most importantly, we have high levels of inflation as well. Well, why does that contradict the Phillips curve, and especially the short-run Phillips curve? As the short-run Phillips curve suggests, if you have high inflation, you're going to have low levels of unemployment. But stagflation, of course, you have high levels of unemployment, but also you have high levels of inflation. Thus, it acts as an evaluation point for this theory. And when did the UK see stagflation? We saw a bit after the post-energy, so like 2021, but the main example in the UK of stagflation was, of course, the 1970s. We had very high rates of unemployment. We had around 20, I think we peaked at 26% inflation rate. So definitely one of the main examples is the 1970s, but really good evaluation for the Phillips curve. It questions all the main theory behind the Phillips curve, so it works really well. And another great one, a bit more specific to the labour markets section in the spec, is how evaluation this depends on the level of hysteresis. So why does the Phillips curve depend on the level of hysteresis? Basically what hysteresis, however you say it, is essentially where when workers remain unemployed for long periods of time, they lose their skill, they develop problems like mental health problems. And therefore, as the Phillips curve suggests, it suggests very easy mobility between high and low levels of unemployment. But what hysteresis suggests is that if we have high unemployment for a long period of time, we're not just going to be able to get back to lower levels of unemployment easily, as lots of workers will lose their skill. Therefore, you can almost say the productive potential of the economy will massively decrease. So this acts as a massive evaluation point for the Phillips curve, as it questions the validity again of the Phillips curve. So basically, hysteresis suggests that unemployment is more sticky rather than as free-flowing as the Phillips curve suggests. Moving on, with regards to other paragraphs and other conflicts between the macro objectives of inflation, another great one to mention is, of course, inflation versus economic growth. And why is that? For example, when the UK government pursue expansionary monetary policy, what we're trying to do, and what is expansionary monetary policy? If we break it down into the very simple bits, monetary policy is which type of policy? Supply demand side. It is a demand side policy. It's going to affect the demand side of the economy. Thus, when we refer to the demand side of the economy, most of the effects are on AD. So, when we're pursuing expansion monetary policy, we're trying to expand the economy. What do? We should lower the interest rates. But what does that do overall? And what is the main effect of expansion monetary policy? The main intended effect of it, of course, is going to cause AD to shift outwards from AD to AD1. And what effect does this have on the economy in terms of price level? Of course, price level increases on PL1 to PL2. And what type of inflation do we call this? We call this demand pull inflation. But why does this represent a trade-off? As, for example, what is our objective with economic growth? Of course, it's positive and high economic growth. And we can see that. Where can we see that? We can see that here. Why? Real GDP is increasing, but But why does the increase in real GDP represent economic growth? Make sure you remember that definition, that link. That economic growth is literally defined by an increase in real GDP. Why? If real GDP increases, it means we're producing more goods and services in the economy. If more goods and services are being produced, we say that is economic growth. But how does this represent the trade-off? It shows that when we are getting an increase in real GDP, economic growth, that is also coupled with inflationary pressures, thus meaning we cannot achieve both simultaneously, meaning that the macroeconomic objectives of low and stable inflation, 2% plus or minus 1%, will trade off, will conflict with our macro objective of positive economic growth. Of course, there's lots of application you can throw in there. Classic one I used to mention a lot in the earlier videos is the UK suffered during 2022 to 2023 8 months of consecutive double-digit inflation. Of course, some of them were due to a really good example there with inflation. But now moving on to valuation, this point is obviously slightly more simple than the previous point. But how could you evaluate the trade-off between inflation and economic growth? So essentially we're asking, when can we get when can we get economic growth without receiving inflationary pressures? Let's try to think about that on the diagram. Instead of AD shifting outwards, if we simply have a shift outwards of SRAS, this will therefore mean we can achieve economic growth where we can see the economy grows from YE to Y1 and we do not suffer inflationary pressures. We actually suffer the opposite, which is, so you could say, disinflation or deflationary pressures, where the economy, the inflation rate drops from PL1 to PL2. And of course, there's a few other scenarios as well. Let's think about LRAS. That's a horrible LRAS. But if LRAS shifts outwards from LRAS to LRAS1 and AD somewhere like this, we would get an increase in real GDP. And we'd also get, again, deflationary or just non-inflationary pressures. Okay, so another great paragraph you can talk about is with regards to contractionary monetary policy. And what is one of the main components of contraction monetary policy, like we said, is of course increasing the interest rates. Where have we seen this recently in the UK economy? We saw this, of course, post-COVID, where in 2021, I think it was December 2021, interest rates were the lowest they've ever been, which is 0.1%. And then in just under 2 years, we saw interest rates in 2023, we saw interest rates spike up to 5.25%. So very sharp increases in interest rates. Of course, what it was the main aim to curb spending, to curb consumption, to slow down the economy, to slow down that inflation rate. But now let's think about the possible macroeconomic conflict here. So trying to take a slightly different spin, and it's a really interesting chain of analysis this is. So by increasing interest rates, how does it affect investors into the UK economy? And specifically, how does it affect hot money flows? Of course, if interest rates are higher, this means the return on savings within the UK is higher. Therefore, foreign investors, will move their money into the UK as they're guaranteed high interest rates, meaning more return on their savings. Thus, there's more incentive to save within the UK. So with increasing interest rates due to contraction monetary policy, there's increased amounts of hot money flows. And if there's increased amounts of hot money flows, the supply and demand of the UK pound, and how do we represent it? Of course, it's just a supply and demand diagram, very simple. So exchange rate on our y-axis, and exchange rate on a y-axis, quantity pound on an x-axis. Now, if there's increased interest rate, meaning foreign investors want to invest within the UK as there's high return on savings, how is it going to affect the demand for the currency? Of course, this is going to mean demand for the currency shifts from D to D+1, and now what effect will that have on the currency overall? So exchange rate is going to increase from ER1 to now ER2, and what do we call when we have an increase in exchange rate? That, of course, is called an appreciation. Now, let's try and link this to another macro objective. What macro objective will an appreciation of the pound affect? Of course, it affects many macro objectives, but more specifically, if you think back to that acronym we learned, which is SPICY, how does it affect imports? How does it affect exports? So if the pound is appreciated, that is another word for saying the pound is stronger, therefore imports are cheaper, exports are more expensive. How will that now affect the current account? If imports are cheaper, exports are more expensive. So if imports are cheaper, it means that import expenditure will increase, as they're cheaper to import, meaning that consumers will demand more. And if our exports are more expensive, it means that they will be less competitive on global markets, as they're more expensive, meaning that export revenue will decrease. So increase import expenditure, decrease export revenue. That is a recipe for a worse current account, therefore worsening our current account deficit. So essentially the main point here would be when the UK is trying to conflict control their inflation. So when inflation is too high, of course, they pursue contractionary policies that can trade off with other macro objectives. And a really developed chain of analysis link could be when we're trying to control the inflation rate, it can actually lead to a worsened current account deficit for the UK. And of course, you use the classic evaluation points here, like the Marshall condition, the J curve, since of course it works quite well here. I'm not going to go through them in detail, of course. I have full videos dedicated to explaining those valuation points in detail and how to structure them, how to go through them step by step. Of course, you could comment on the other assumptions we made, like hot money flows. Depends on the degree to how much hot money flows within the UK economy. Depends on the relative amount of increase of interest rates. Since we're assuming there's a stark increase, a sharp increase in interest rates, we're very small, a very light increase in interest rates, thus not causing as many hot money flows, meaning that the pound doesn't appreciate as much, meaning that the current account doesn't actually, maybe the current account isn't even affected. Of course, with regards to the current account, again, you could talk about short run versus long run, since of course that definitely affects it. But yeah, there's lots of valuation points here, and that is pretty much how I'm going to wrap up this 12-mark question. Lots of different points here, just a classic, a really good one for the past papers and really good one for practice, as just a classic macroeconomic objectives trade-off question. But yeah, that is that 12-mark question done. But yeah, a really good one for practice there.